Right now, at this moment, while you are watching this, there are instruments buried in the ground outside Los Angeles, reporting a number that has never been recorded before. Not the highest this decade, not the highest since the last big one, the highest in 1,000 years. A study published this month put a four-dimensional model on the fault system underneath 13 million people and reconstructed every earthquake that has hit that ground since the year 1026. The finding is that the strain loaded into those faults right now exceeds anything in the entire record. And buried in that same paper is a second finding, one that got almost no coverage, which changes what the next Southern California earthquake actually is. But Los Angeles is not the worst thing on this list. There is a fault 700 miles long off the coast of Oregon and Washington that is the only structure in the continental United States physically capable of a magnitude 9. It last fired in the year 1700. We know the exact date down to the evening. Nobody was there to write it down. And neither of those is the fault that seismologists actually lose sleep over. That one is under 16 million people, and it is now 10 years past due. 3 loaded systems, all 3 measured continuously. For 2 of them, the federal government has already run the body count. And in the last 2 months, this planet has demonstrated twice in 2 different countries exactly what happens when the arithmetic finishes. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because I want to know how many of you are already standing inside one of these 3 zones. Subscribe if you want the follow-up, because these numbers are moving every week right now. Start with what June proved. On the 8th of June, a magnitude 7.8 ruptured off southern Mindanao in the Philippines. 16 days later, on the 24th, a magnitude 7.5 hit northern Venezuela. The Philippine event released roughly twice the energy of the Venezuelan one. The bigger earthquake killed about 45 people. The smaller one killed more than 5,000, a factor of over 100 running backwards. 4 things decided: how deep the rupture was, how far it sat from people, what those people were standing inside, and whether anyone knew it was coming. The Philippines got 2 of 4. The rupture was between 33 and 55 kilometers down, deep enough that a large fraction of the energy was absorbed by rock before it reached anyone, and it was offshore, about 32 kilometers from the nearest coast. It still did damage. Buildings came down in General Santos City. Parts of St. Elizabeth Hospital were wrecked badly enough that staff evacuated patients into the open air. Landslides cut off entire villages. Waves up to 1.4 meters came ashore, and tsunami warnings went out to 5 countries. 45 dead, more than 480 injured. Venezuela got 0 of 4. The main shock ruptured at about 10 kilometers. There was almost nothing between the fault and the street to absorb it. The rupture zone sat directly underneath the coastal state of La Guaira, not near it, under it, and Caracas took roughly 60 seconds of continuous shaking. Years of economic collapse meant building maintenance had been deferred indefinitely, and construction standards in the dense neighborhoods were never enforced. So hundreds of thousands of people were inside unreinforced brick and block that was never engineered to bend. And there was no warning system of any kind, not a degraded one, none. Nobody got a single second, and it was not one earthquake. A magnitude 7.2 hit first. 39 seconds later, the 7.5. 39 seconds is not enough time to reach a doorway, let alone a street. Seismologists call this a doublet, 2 separate events with nearly identical waveforms and origin points, and it is genuinely rare. Combined, it was the most powerful seismic event in Venezuela since 1900. In La Guaira, roughly 80% of buildings collapsed. The numbers are still climbing. More than 5,000 confirmed dead. over 16,700 injured. The United Nations estimates around 50,000 people remain unaccounted for underneath the rubble, a figure humanitarian chief Tom Fletcher called terrifyingly plausible. The Venezuelan government has refused to publish an official missing persons count at all, so those estimates come from crowdsourced platforms run by Venezuelans themselves, which have listed between 18,000 and over 41,000 at various points. Satellite radar identified roughly 58,870 buildings damaged or destroyed. Direct physical damage came in at $6.7 billion, about 6% of the entire national economy, with a later United Nations assessment putting total direct damage at $37 billion once roads, ports, water, telecommunications, and energy were counted. Depth, distance, buildings, warning. Hold those four. Southern California first, because that is where the science moved this month. On the 3rd of June, a paper appeared in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth, from Liliane Burkhardt, Bridget Smith-Conter, Catherine Scharrer, and David Sandwell, working out of the University of Bern, the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and the United States Geological Survey. They built a 4-dimensional earthquake cycle model, meaning it simulates the faults in 3 dimensions and tracks how they change through time, and fed it 1,000 years of paleoseismic rupture history for the southern San Andreas and the neighboring San Jacinto system. Stress on multiple segments has now reached, and in places past, the highest levels in the entire millennium. The San Jacinto Bernardino segment measured 3.6 megapascals, the single highest load anywhere in the whole 1,000-year reconstruction, beating its own previous peak from 50 years ago. The Mojave South segment of the San Andreas came in at 2.8 and broke its own record from a decade ago. Understand what accumulates and why it cannot stop. Faults do not slide smoothly. 2 plates try to move past each other, friction locks them in the upper crust, and the deeper rock keeps moving anyway. Energy that cannot become motion becomes stored strain, like a spring being wound tighter every single year. The southern San Andreas last had a major rupture in 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake, magnitude 7.9. That is 169 years of winding. The plates have not paused for 1 day since. Now the second finding, the one that got almost no coverage. The 2 fault systems meet at a junction called Cajon Pass, less than 60 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. The researchers call it an earthquake gate. Under some stress conditions, the junction stops a rupture dead. Under others, it lets the rupture through, and a single fault earthquake becomes a 2-fault earthquake. In 1812, the magnitude 7.5 Wrightwood event is suspected of doing exactly that, running the gate and rippling along both systems at once. A joint rupture crossing Cajon Pass today, in Burkhardt's own words, could approach magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 and affect a far larger area than a single fault event, not one corridor. The Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley simultaneously. And here is what the model found about when that gate opens. Historically, ruptures crossed the junction when the stress on both sides was closely matched, a difference of around 0.3 megapascals. The gap right now measures 0.8 and it is narrowing. Burkhardt's exact phrasing was that matched stress on both sides is the configuration we are approaching today. Approaching, which tells you the direction of travel, and there is no mechanism in physics by which that reverses. The stress is at a 1,000-year maximum and still climbing. The gap is closing. The only thing that ever unwinds a wound spring is release. Kate Scherer of the USGS, one of the study's authors, put it plainly. Because it has been such a long time since either system had a large earthquake, an enormous amount of stress has accumulated. Ahmed El-Banna, director of the statewide California Earthquake Center at USC, said it could happen today, tomorrow, in 10 years, or in 30, and that geologically, those are the same answer. So what does the aftermath look like? We have a disturbingly precise answer, because the USGS and the California Geological Survey put more than 300 scientists and engineers on this exact scenario, a magnitude 7.8 on the southern San Andreas. It is called shakeout, and it is still the most detailed model of a major American earthquake ever produced. 1,800 dead, 50,000 injuries requiring emergency care, more than $200 billion in losses. And the largest single killer in that scenario is not collapsing buildings, it is fire. The model projects roughly 1,600 separate ignitions from ruptured gas lines and sparking electrical systems. Fire alone accounts for about $87 billion of the total, the biggest line item in the entire study and over half the projected deaths, because the water mains break in the same second the gas lines do. Hundreds of fires begin burning at the exact moment the hydrants run dry, and every fire crew in the county is trying to cross freeways that are no longer continuous. That is not a hypothetical. It is precisely what happened in San Francisco in 1906, where fire destroyed far more of the city than the shaking ever did. Run the 4 variables on Los Angeles. The rupture would be shallow. 13 million people sit directly on top, on basin soil that amplifies seismic waves instead of damping them. Warning is genuinely good, and that is the one bright spot, because Shake Alert is live across California, Oregon, and Washington, and it fired correctly for a magnitude 5.7 near Silver Springs, Nevada this April, reaching people as far away as Sacramento, which leaves buildings, and buildings is the variable that decides the number of funerals. When Los Angeles passed its retrofit ordinances in 2015, it identified more than 13,000 soft-story buildings, the kind with open ground floor parking underneath occupied apartments, plus roughly 1,500 non-ductile concrete structures built before 1976 with too little reinforcing steel at the columns and joints. Those are the buildings that do not sag, they drop. Retrofitting is expensive and slow and politically miserable, and Los Angeles County only began moving on its side of the concrete problem years after the city did. Los Angeles has an itemized list of the specific buildings that will kill its residents. That list still has thousands of addresses on it, and Los Angeles is not the biggest fault on that coast. Go north. The Cascadia subduction zone runs about 700 miles from Cape Mendocino in Northern California to Vancouver Island, sitting 70 to 100 miles offshore. It is the only fault in the continental United States physically capable of producing a magnitude 9. Not a 7, a 9. That is roughly 1,000 times the energy of a magnitude 7. It last ruptured on the 26th of January, 1700, at somewhere between magnitude 8.7 and 9.2. And here is how we know the date on a prehistoric earthquake off an uninhabited coast. The tsunami it generated crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and struck Japan, where officials wrote it down. Japanese records from that week describe a destructive wave that arrived with no earthquake felt beforehand. They had no idea where it came from. They called it an orphan tsunami. It took until the 1980s and 90s for scientists to trace that orphan back to a fault on the other side of an ocean, matching it against tree rings from ghost forests of cedar killed when the coastline suddenly dropped, against layers of tsunami sand buried in coastal marshes, against underwater landslide deposits on the seafloor, and against indigenous oral histories that had carried the event accurately for 300 years. That was 326 years ago. The USGS hazard model uses a recurrence interval of about 500 years for full margin ruptures, though the geological record shows gaps ranging from 200 years to more than 800. It is not a clock, but the current time-dependent probability is roughly 15% for a magnitude 9 within 50 years, and around 30% for a magnitude 8 or greater in southern Cascadia in that same window. Roughly 1 in 3, inside the lifetime of most people watching this. And a 9 is not a bigger version of a 7. It is a different category of event, and this is the part almost nobody understands. A magnitude 7.8 on the San Andreas gives you maybe a minute of violent shaking. A full margin Cascadia rupture gives you 6 to 10 minutes of it. Sit with that. 6 minutes of ground motion so violent that standing is impossible. Buildings that survive the first minute fail in the fourth. Buildings that survive the fourth fail in the seventh. Every structure in the Pacific Northwest gets tested not once, but continuously for longer than most people can hold their breath, twice over. Then the coastline drops. In places by 1 to 2 meters, instantly and permanently, and the ocean comes in behind it. FEMA and Oregon planners model waves reaching up to roughly 100 feet on the outer coast, arriving in 15 to 30 minutes. There is no warning system on this planet that saves you if you are standing on that beach. The FEMA Region 10 planning figures, if it happened tomorrow, more than 13,800 dead, 107,000 injured, economic impact across Washington, Oregon, and California exceeding $70 billion. FEMA's Cascadia Rising exercise puts more than 8 million people inside the projected damage zone. And Oregon's own emergency management department tells its residents in writing to expect no services and no outside assistance for at least 2 weeks, with coastal towns cut off by road for about that long, because the bridges on the routes in will not exist anymore. Now run the 4 variables on the Pacific Northwest. The rupture is shallow near the trench. It is offshore, which helps with shaking and is catastrophic for tsunami. Warning covers the shaking, and nothing on Earth covers a 15-minute wave. And buildings. Seattle and Portland built most of their housing stock, their schools, their hospitals, and their bridges during a period when nobody knew this fault existed. The subduction zone was not widely accepted as seismically active until the 1980s. 2 major American cities were substantially constructed before their own engineers knew what they were sitting on top of. And neither of these is the one that keeps seismologists awake. Istanbul. 16 million people. The North Anatolian Fault runs about 20 kilometers to the south of the city, and it is one of the best understood strike-slip faults on the planet, because across the 20th century, it produced a sequence of major earthquakes that marched steadily westward across Turkey, one segment at a time, in a pattern so consistent that scientists have used it to project where the next one lands. The 1999 Izmit earthquake, magnitude 7.6, killed more than 17,000 people. That was the most recent event in the westward march. The next segment in line is the section beneath the Sea of Marmara, directly south of the city. It has not produced a magnitude 7 or greater since 1766. Historical records there run back more than 2,000 years and indicate an average repeat interval of about 250 years. 260 years elapsed on a 250-year fault. Geodetic measurements show a slip deficit of at least 4 meters on that locked section. That is not a rate. That is the distance the fault has to travel to catch up with the plate motion around it. And when it releases, it travels that distance in seconds. Probability studies put a magnitude 7.3 or larger near Istanbul at around 35% over 30 years, rising to about 47% in models that account for elapsed time and for the stress that the 1999 event transferred onto that exact segment. In April of 2025, a magnitude 6.2 in the Marmara Sea sent more than 350 people to hospitals, mostly from panic and from people jumping out of windows, and emptied the streets of Istanbul at 2 in the morning. It killed nobody. And when researchers at the GFZ Helmholtz Center in Germany analyzed it against nearly 20 years of records from that fault, they found it released nowhere near enough strain to reduce the long-term risk. They also found something else. Since 2011, the magnitude 5 and greater events on that fault have been migrating eastward, ending closer and closer to the locked section directly beneath the city. The seismicity is walking toward Istanbul, and large parts of that city carry the exact vulnerabilities that turned Venezuela's earthquake into a mass casualty event. Older building stock, uneven enforcement, dense settlements built fast. Turkey has more capacity than Venezuela and active retrofit programs, but the gap between where that city is and where it needs to be is measured in years of construction work, and a fault does not wait for a construction schedule. So here is the board. Southern California, holding the most stored strain in 1,000 years, on a junction actively closing toward the configuration that lets ruptures cross into a two-fault event. Above 13 million people, with thousands of identified lethal buildings still standing and occupied tonight. Cascadia, 326 years into a 500-year average, capable of a magnitude 9, 6 to 10 minutes of shaking, and a 100-foot wall of water, aimed at cities built before anyone knew the fault was there. Marmara, 10 years past its average recurrence with 4 meters owed, under 16 million people, with the earthquakes around it stepping toward the city one at a time. None of the three has fired, and 2026 is running below average. Through the first half of this year, the planet produced somewhere between 5 and 8 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater, against a long-term average of about 15 or 16 a year. Magnitude 8 so far this year, 0. Last year there were 15 sevens and an 8.8. The year before that, 10 sevens. In 2023, 19. 5,000 dead in Venezuela, 50,000 missing. $37 billion of a country erased in under a minute. 45 dead in the Philippines from a larger event. That is the floor. That is what this planet cost on a slow year with the 3 biggest guns still loaded and none of them fired. The hazard has not increased. What has increased is the number of human beings standing directly on top of it. Tokyo, Jakarta, Manila, Istanbul, Karachi, Mexico City, Lima, Los Angeles, Seattle. Every one of those a city of millions sitting inside reach of a fault that is being measured in real time by instruments reporting tonight. So here is what you can actually control. Start from the correct threat model. In a survivable earthquake, in a building that does not come down, the thing most likely to hurt you is objects falling and you moving while the floor moves. Afterward, in a dense city, the thing most likely to take your neighborhood is fire. Bolt the tall furniture into wall studs. Strap the water heater and understand why that specific one matters. A water heater tipping is both a crush hazard and a gas line rupture. And gas line ruptures are the fire that Shakeout says kills more people than the buildings do. Know where your gas shutoff valve is and zip tie the wrench to the pipe because you will not go hunting through a kitchen drawer in the dark. When it starts, drop, cover, hold on. Do not run outside because the single most dangerous strip of ground in an earthquake is the pavement immediately outside a building where facade material and glass land. And do not stand in a doorway. That advice is a genuine relic from unreinforced adobe houses where the door frame was the only rigid thing left standing. In a modern building, the doorway is no stronger than the wall beside it. You are next to a heavy swinging door and you have nothing above your head. Store water and store far more than you think. The old 72-hour guidance has been quietly revised toward 2 weeks in serious planning documents, and Oregon tells its residents 2 weeks outright. In a regional event, nobody is arriving on your specific street on day 2, and water is the slowest utility to come back. Build the family communication plan around a single out-of-area contact that everyone texts. Local networks jam within minutes because everyone calls at once. Text, queue, and get through when calls will not. If you are on a coast and the shaking is strong enough that standing is difficult, do not wait for a siren, an app, or an alert. Move uphill or inland immediately. On the Cascadia coast, you may have 15 minutes, and there is no version of the future in which a warning system saves you inside that window. The shaking is the warning. And turn the alerts on. In California, Oregon, and Washington, that is the MyShake app and your phone's emergency settings. Japan does it by default. Everyone else has to choose it. Last thing, nobody can predict an earthquake. Not next week, not next year. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling you something. But prediction was never the point, and that is what the Cajon Pass study actually represents. We cannot tell you when. We can now tell you with real precision how much energy is loaded into a specific segment of a specific fault, how that compares against every century of the last millennium, and what the released version does to the cities standing on top of it. That is not fortune telling. That is an inventory. And an inventory is the only thing that has ever gotten a building retrofitted, a sensor network funded, or a school drilled. The spring under Southern California is wound tighter than it has been in 1,000 years, and it is still winding tonight. Cascadia is 326 years into its cycle, holding the only magnitude 9 on the continent. Marmara is a decade overdue with 4 meters owed under 16 million people, and the earthquakes are walking toward the city. The Earth already made its decision. It made it the moment those plates locked and kept moving anyway. And the arithmetic has been running every second since, without one day of interruption, through every war and election and news cycle in human history. The only variable still open is what is standing on top when it finishes. 5,000 people in Venezuela found that out in June. Subscribe, because all 3 of these are going to keep generating news and the readings keep moving. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because I want to know how many of you are already inside one of these zones. See you in the next one.